Hey everybody, welcome to my video on stabilization policy. This is for your principles of macro class, or if you have a combined class, maybe that one instead. But here's our deal. Stabilization policy is about short-run macroeconomics, and our goal is going to be to reduce or minimize the business cycle. So here's a little picture of a hand-drawn business cycle. Y bar represents potential GDP with full employment, the natural rate of unemployment, full production, whatever. And the green line, Y star, represents current GDP. Now, as I've discussed before, current GDP cycles around potential GDP, or Y bar. Sometimes it's above it, sometimes it's below it. When it's above Y bar, we have really low unemployment, but we might have high inflation. When it's below Y bar, we have higher unemployment and people are out of work. Our goal as economists is going to be to reduce this cycle and stay as close to Y bar as possible. So let me draw an example of what this might look like if we successfully reduce the cycle. It might look something like this. It'll still have some ups and downs, but they won't be nearly as steep or prominent. It will stay close to Y bar. This is a much more stable Y star and a more stable economy. Now the ideal, of course, would be to have it perfectly stable and just stay on Y bar, but even the purple line though is still worth doing. So let me restate this goal. Our goal is to have our short-run GDP, Y star, equal our long-run GDP, Y bar. And if we can't get it exact, then we'll just get as close to it as possible. Cool, so there's the goal. Now, think about what that means though for a minute. We're going to talk about policy, specifically policy that takes GDP during bad times and props it up and makes it higher, but also GDP that takes our economy in good times and slows it down. And the goal is to reduce the uncertainty and the effects of the business cycle and to focus more on the growth itself of Y bar. First, let's talk about what happens if we don't stabilize the economy. And we have different answers for recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps. If we have a recessionary gap, then Y star is less than Y bar, which looks like this. The X, for the short-run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve, is to the left of Y bar, the long-run aggregate supply. What happens as we wait for the long run? Well, in a recession, prices tend to be falling, especially input prices like your labor. As firms start signing on new contracts during a recession, they're going to sign a lot of people on at lower wages, and other input prices may also go down. As we adjust our expectations of the future downwards during a recession, input prices go down, and that will cause an increase in the short-run aggregate supply curve. And this increase will happen until we reach Y bar. As long as Y star is less than Y bar, the SRAS curve will have a rightward shift during the transition to the long run. And I should point out, this can take years. This can be a very long process. That's why we call the long run the long run. It takes a while to get there. Now, what about this other situation for an inflationary gap? Well, that's when Y star is greater than Y bar. And so everything's going to be in reverse. We have this X to the right of Y bar. We can wait for the long run, and when we do, prices are going to start rising. That's why we call it an inflationary gap. When you have really low unemployment, there's potential for wages to rise and other input costs, which decreases the supply curve. This also can take years to do. So there's the first part of the story. We don't have to do anything. We can wait, and the business cycle will correct itself. If GDP is too high, it'll go down. If it's too low, it'll go up. Or we can try to fix it sooner. Rather than waiting for years for the long run, we could actually do something to change it now. So what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of waiting for the short-run aggregate supply curve to adjust, we're going to directly manipulate the aggregate demand curve. So first let's talk about in a recessionary gap. And there we are again with the X to the left of Y bar. we're trying to get to y bar. Our goal is to get the x to be on that curve. And if you do that by moving the demand curve, then your only choice is to increase demand. If you increase demand, you can put the x on the y bar. So increasing aggregate demand can close your output gap. That will be the goal of our policy. We can take a negative gap in GDP and get rid of it by increasing aggregate demand. In an inflationary gap, the opposite happens. Here's our model, x is to the right, it's an inflationary gap. We're trying to get to this SRAS curve. How do we do it? We can do it by lowering the demand curve until it looks like this. Decreasing aggregate demand can close the output gap. Notice, increasing to get out of a recessionary gap, decreasing to get out of an inflationary gap. The red we call expansionary policy. Increasing aggregate demand is expansionary policy because it creates an expansion. It increases GDP, increases aggregate demand. Decreasing aggregate demand is something we call contractionary policy because it can cause a contraction. It causes the economy to shrink a bit. It reduces aggregate demand. So one thing you'll note is that these are counter-cyclical. When GDP is low, we try to push it up. And when it's high, we try to push it down. We're always working against the business cycle. That's what you have to do if you want to take these big green swings and turn them into smaller purple swings. You have to push against the swing and keep it towards the middle. So some policy spoilers for later. Here's our little table. We're going to talk about expansionary versus contractionary policy, taxes, government spending, the money supply, and when they should do these things. I'll have details on all of this stuff later, but for now, for expansionary policy, cutting taxes, boosting government spending, increasing the money supply are all things you want to do during a recessionary gap. Those are all things that will increase aggregate demand and increase GDP, thus helping you get out of your recessionary gap. Contractionary policy would be raising taxes, cutting government spending, reducing the money supply, and these are all things that you would do during an inflationary gap. So let's draw these on here again. What's it going to look like? Well, if we're in this recessionary gap over here, cutting taxes, raising government spending, or increasing the money supply would all be things that could increase aggregate demand and potentially close our output gap. Raising taxes, cutting government spending, reducing the money supply are all things that could reduce aggregate demand, therefore getting us out of our inflationary gap. So I don't know exactly how helpful this was to you. Hopefully it was a good overview. If not, too bad. Thanks for watching anyway, guys. Good luck and happy econing.